The first shot of bourbon burned going down. Tommy O'Brien slammed the glass on the bar and grinned at the man sitting next to him. "Your turn, fancy boy." The man picked up his shot glass, examined it, took a sip, just a sip, like he was tasting wine at a restaurant. Tommy laughed. "You gotta drink it all, pal. That's how this works." The man nodded, then drank the rest of the shot, slowly, carefully, like an amateur. Tommy's grin widened. This was going to be even easier than he thought. "Second round," Tommy announced to Jack the bartender, "and keep 'em coming." Jack poured 2 more shots. Tommy grabbed his immediately and downed it. The man in the sport coat took his time again, sipped first, then drank. By the 3rd shot, Tommy was feeling good, confident. The guy across from him was barely keeping up, probably already feeling it, probably 1 or 2 more shots away from admitting defeat. By the 5th shot, Tommy was starting to slur his words, but that was normal. That's how he operated. He'd push through the slurring, through the stumbling, through everything. He was the tank. He never lost. The man in the sport coat, though, looked completely fine. His eyes were clear, his hands were steady, he hadn't even loosened his tie. By the 7th shot, Tommy was having trouble staying on his stool. His vision was blurring, the room was spinning just a little. The man still looked sober. By the 10th shot, Tommy O'Brien fell off his stool and collapsed onto the floor of McGinty's bar. The man in the sport coat was still sitting upright, still perfectly composed. He hadn't broken a sweat. Jack the bartender looked at the collapsed Tommy, then at the man who'd just destroyed him. "You want to tell him?" Jack asked. Dean Martin smiled. "Let's wait until he can hear it." Because what Tommy didn't know yet was that he'd just lost a drinking contest to someone who hadn't drunk a drop of alcohol all night. Dean had been drinking water, the bartender had been switching the glasses, and Tommy had just learned why you should never challenge someone to do the thing that made them famous. To understand how this happened, you need to go back about 2 hours to when Dean Martin walked into McGinty's bar on the south side of Chicago. It was March 1968. Dean was in Chicago performing at the Chicago Theater, 6 shows over 3 days. He'd just finished his 2nd show of the night. It was late, almost midnight, and Dean was exhausted. Normally, Dean would go back to his hotel, order room service, go to sleep. But tonight, he wanted something different. He wanted to be anonymous for a few hours, to sit in a regular bar with regular people and just have a quiet drink. So he told his driver to drop him off on the south side, working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where nobody would expect to see Dean Martin. He walked into McGinty's wearing a baseball cap and a regular sport coat. No tuxedo, no entourage, just Dean, looking like any other middle-aged guy who wanted a beer after work.
The bar was mostly empty, a few regulars, a couple watching the corner television, and one guy at the end of the bar who was clearly already drunk. Dean sat down and ordered bourbon. The bartender, an older man named Jack Murphy, looked at him and his eyes went wide. He recognized Dean immediately. Dean put a finger to his lips, the universal signal for "keep this quiet." Jack nodded and poured the drink. He understood. Dean wanted privacy, anonymity, just a normal guy having a normal drink in a normal bar. For about 20 minutes, that's exactly what Dean got. He sat quietly, sipped his bourbon, watched the television. Nobody bothered him. It was peaceful. Then the drunk at the end of the bar noticed him. Tommy O'Brien had been drinking at McGinty's since 6 p.m. It was now close to midnight. He was what the regulars called the tank. He could drink anyone under the table. It was his one talent, the one thing he was known for. Tommy looked at Dean and saw an opportunity, a new face, someone he'd never challenged before, someone in a nice sport coat who looked like he probably couldn't handle his liquor. "Hey, fancy boy," Tommy called out. His words were already slurred. You look like you can't hold your liquor." Dean turned slowly. He'd been recognized plenty of times. People asking for autographs, pictures, that's fine. But this guy didn't seem to know who he was. This guy just seemed drunk and looking for a fight. "I do okay," Dean said quietly. Tommy slid off his stool and walked toward Dean. "I bet you $100 I can drink you under the table." Jack, the bartender, immediately stepped in. "Tommy, you don't want to do this." "Stay out of it, Jack," Tommy said. "This is between me and Fancy Boy here. What do you say? You got $100? Dean looked at Tommy, then at Jack. Jack was shaking his head slightly, trying to communicate something, but Dean understood what was happening. This drunk didn't know who he was, didn't know that Dean Martin's entire career was built on pretending to be exactly what Tommy actually was. Dean smiled. This was going to be fun. "I'm in," Dean said. Tommy rubbed his hands together. "Jack, set us up. First one to quit or pass out loses. $100. Jack hesitated. He wanted to tell Tommy the truth, wanted to grab him and say, "That's Dean Martin, the guy who's been acting drunk on TV for 15 years. You're about to challenge a professional." But Dean gave Jack a look that said, "Let it happen." So Jack poured the first round, 2 shots of bourbon. Before Tommy could grab his glass, Dean leaned over to Jack and whispered, "After this first one, switch mine to water. Keep the same glass. He won't notice." Jack understood immediately. Dean was going to fake it the whole thing, just like he faked it on television, just like he'd been faking it for his entire career. Tommy downed his first shot. Dean drank his too. Real bourbon. He wanted to sell it, make it look real. Jack poured the second round, but in Dean's glass he poured water, clear liquid that looked exactly like vodka or gin. Tommy didn't notice. He was already feeling the first shot. And that's how the contest started. Tommy drinking real bourbon, Dean drinking water. Shot after shot after shot. By the third shot, Tommy was confident. He could see the other guy taking his time, sipping first like an amateur. Tommy was sure this would be over in 5 or 6 shots. By the 5th shot, Tommy was slurring, but he'd been slurring since before the contest started, so that was fine. He was the tank. He could handle it. But something was wrong. The guy in the sport coat still looked completely sober. His eyes were clear. His hands weren't shaking. He was sitting perfectly straight on his stool. Tommy, on the other hand, was starting to lean. The room was getting fuzzy around the edges. "You doing okay there, pal?" Dean asked, his voice steady and calm. "I'm fine," Tommy slurred. "Keep pouring, Jack." By the 7th shot, Tommy was barely holding on. His hands were shaking when he reached for the glass. He had to concentrate hard just to get the liquid into his mouth without spilling. Dean picked up his glass of water, examined it like it was fine bourbon, and drank it smoothly, placed the glass back on the bar without a tremor. The other people in the bar were starting to notice. The couple in the corner had stopped watching television and were watching the contest instead. One of the regulars was placing bets on who would last longer. By the 9th shot, Tommy could barely see straight. The room was spinning, his stomach was churning, but he was the tank. He couldn't lose, not to some fancy guy in a sport coat, not in his bar. He reached for the 10th shot. His hand missed the glass twice before he finally grabbed it. He lifted it to his mouth, drank it, and that was it. Tommy O'Brien fell backwards off his stool and hit the floor, hard. The bar went silent. Dean Martin sat calmly at the bar, looking completely sober, like he'd just finished 10 glasses of water, which in fact he had. Jack came around the bar to check on Tommy. He was breathing, just passed out, drunk off his ass. "Should we tell him now?" Jack asked Dean. "Let's wait until he wakes up. I want to see his face." About 20 minutes later, Tommy started to come around. He was lying on the floor of McGinty's with half the bar standing around him, staring. "What happened?" Tommy groaned. "You lost," Jack said. "Lost what?" "The drinking contest. To him." Jack pointed at Dean, still sitting at the bar, still looking perfectly fine.
Tommy's brain struggled to process this. "That's impossible. I never lose. How many shots did we do?" "10," Jack said. "And he's still sitting there?" "He is." Tommy tried to stand up, failed, tried again, managed to get to his knees. "How? How is that possible?" Dean turned on his stool and looked at Tommy. "Because I wasn't drinking bourbon. I was drinking water." Tommy blinked. "Water?" "Water," Dean confirmed. "Jack switched my glass after the first shot." But why would you— Who would think to—" Dean smiled. "Because you challenged me to a drinking contest, and I've spent the last 15 years of my career pretending to be drunk on television. I thought it might be interesting to see if the act worked in real life. Could I convince someone that I was drinking when I wasn't? Turns out he could." Tommy stared at him, really looked at him for the first time. The face, the voice, the way he moved, it all clicked. "You're Dean Martin," Tommy whispered. "That's right. I challenged Dean Martin to a drinking contest? You did." Tommy put his face in his hands. "I'm an idiot." Dean stood up and walked over to Tommy, reached into his pocket and pulled out $200 bills, handed them to Tommy. "What's this?" Tommy asked. "You bet 100. I'm giving you 200. Buy everyone in the bar around, and remember something, never challenge someone to do the thing that made them famous." Tommy took the money, still trying to process what had just happened. Dean patted him on the shoulder and walked toward the door. At the exit, he turned back to the bar. "Good night, everyone, and remember, drink responsibly." Then Dean Martin walked out into the Chicago night, leaving behind a bar full of people who would tell this story for the rest of their lives. The story stayed mostly local for decades. The guys at McGinty's would tell it to newcomers. "You hear about the time Tommy challenged Dean Martin to a drinking contest?" It became part of the bar's legend. But the story didn't go public until 2010, when Jack Murphy, the bartender, was interviewed for a book about celebrity encounters in Chicago. He told the whole story: the disguise, the challenge, the water switch, the collapse, everything. The interviewer asked Jack why Dean had done it. Why go through the trouble of pretending to drink when he could have just turned down the challenge? Because Dean was an entertainer, and this was the perfect audience. One drunk guy who had no idea who he was. Dean wanted to see if the act that made him famous on TV could work in real life. Could he convince someone that he was drinking when he wasn't? Turns out he could. The interviewer also tracked down Tommy O'Brien, who was still alive and still occasionally drinking at McGinty's, though much less than he used to.
"I was an idiot," Tommy said, laughing at himself. "I challenged the world's greatest fake drunk to a drinking contest. Of course I lost. He'd been training for that moment his entire career and didn't even know it." "Do you still have the $200 he gave you?" the interviewer asked. Tommy shook his head. "Spent it that night buying rounds for everyone, just like he told me to. But you know what I do have?" He pulled out his wallet and showed a worn, creased dollar bill. "This is from the 200. I kept $1. A reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That you never really know who you're talking to, and that sometimes the person who looks the weakest is actually the strongest. Dean Martin taught me that, the hard way." The lesson of this story goes beyond drinking contests. It's about assumptions. Tommy assumed the well-dressed man at the bar was an easy mark, someone who couldn't handle his liquor, someone soft, someone who could be beaten easily. What Tommy didn't know was that he was looking at someone who had spent thousands of hours studying drunk behavior, someone who had perfected the art of appearing intoxicated while being completely sober, someone whose entire career was built on making people believe something that wasn't true. Dean Martin could have told Tommy who he was, could have avoided the whole thing, but where's the fun in that? Instead, Dean saw an opportunity to test his craft, to see if the skills that made him famous on television could work in a dive bar in Chicago. They could. They did. Perfectly. And Tommy O'Brien learned a lesson that night that he never forgot. Don't judge people by how they look. Don't assume you know someone's capabilities. And definitely don't challenge someone to do the thing they've spent their entire life perfecting. because you're going to lose, and you're going to look like an idiot, and the story is going to be told for the next 50 years. If this story of assumptions and hidden talent moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with anyone who's ever underestimated someone based on appearances. Leave a comment about a time you challenged someone and regretted it. And ring that notification bell for more incredible untold stories about when legends proved exactly why they became legends.